Thank you. That couldn't have been a better segue, I think, actually, in terms of what I'm about to talk to you about. I'm really excited about this. This is information that we've been sharing for some time now, pretty much ever since we put together this information. And basically, what I'm about to present to you, we're going to shed some light on a hot topic, where the big question that came up there actually had to do with what constitutes a complete failure of a cryptocurrency. And basically, I'm about to shed some light on all of that. So the name of the presentation, or I'm going to give a bit of quick background in terms of where I come from. My name is Stephen Dryle. I'm the CEO and one of the co-founders for Nikola Tesla Unite Limited. I'm from Toronto, Canadian, so maybe a slightly different take on things or whatever that may mean. I've been around cryptocurrency since there was only Bitcoin. I've been involved with a number of different projects, whether publicly or anonymously, at all sorts of different levels, participation directly, development, market, all of it, all the kind of stuff for years and years and years. And basically, we put together what we call a framework for the evaluation of any cryptocurrency or token blockchain-based project, essentially. So let's move into it. Basically, a lot of talk surrounding Bitcoin and blockchain technology projects centers around the technology. That's a big focus for obvious reasons. But what I'm here to talk about and shed light on is the fact that a cryptocurrency does not consist just of technology. There are actually three things. A cryptocurrency is technology, community, and liquidity. I'm going to explain why this isn't how we come to this conclusion, but these are three things. They're independent but interrelated. They're all necessary for a cryptocurrency to be viable. How do we know this? Let me show you what the quintessential cryptocurrency elements looks like. These are the components of a viable cryptocurrency ecosystem or economy. If any of these components are missing, it's not a viable cryptocurrency. Now, anybody who's familiar with how cryptocurrency systems work, you probably recognize some or all of the things that are on here. All of these things are different. There may be some similarities, but ultimately, these are all distinctly different things that can also be quantified. So when you're looking at things like servers or nodes or that type of stuff, you can count those types of things, clients, source code repositories, the number of articles, people representing, the number of exchanges that trade something, the number of merchants. All of these things are separate things. They're all quantifiable, and these are all necessary components for a cryptocurrency ecosystem to be viable. If any of these things are missing, you don't have a cryptocurrency. It's that simple. You can take all of these things and essentially loosely divide them into 6 groupings. Now again, there's a little bit of overlap and some of the, there are some similarities, a crossover and that sort of thing, but for the most part, we have these 6 categories: documentation, awareness, conversion, integration, network, and the user experience. And again, you can see how these things are, so awareness is more the marketing side that people are talking about, whereas when the user experience and the network and integration, those types of things get more into the technology side of things. Whereas when we're talking about conversion, we're talking about the exchanges and trading the coins or merchants accepting them as payments or all that, or all those types of things. So again, these are all things that have to exist for a cryptocurrency to be viable. And now we've broken them down into 6 categories, which then work us into 3 groups: community, technology, and liquidity. These are the groups that I mentioned before. These are the things that we refer to as the 3 pillars of a viable cryptocurrency. Viability is associated with the value and the longevity of the cryptocurrency. And basically the way that this works, the bigger the pillars are, the more viability. If any of the pillars are reduced, this reduces your viability. Viability is directly associated with value. And the value is in the middle. So looking at this as a Venn diagram, you can see these things everything is interrelated, they're interconnected, but they're also independent. So we have no coiners here, but you're all part of a Bitcoin community in some regard. You cannot have a coin to be part of the community. You can write articles, documentation, all that kind of stuff, and still be a contributor to one of those pillars. Technology. Technology is essential. It's what enables cryptocurrency to work, but it is not the only thing. It is equally important to community and liquidity. If the technology doesn't exist, obviously we don't have a cryptocurrency. Similarly, if there's no community, there's no people, we don't have a cryptocurrency. Liquidity represents your ability to exchange that coin for something other than the coin. It could be money, but it could be products, services, other coins, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Without liquidity, you don't have a viable cryptocurrency because you can't trade it for anything. Liquidity is affected by technology in the community, and as you can see, this is a very simple diagram that explains how those things work and how they're related. If any of the pillars are small, that reduces your viability. And this is from a visualization perspective, but understand that these are all things that you can quantify. If you were to actually go back to the quintessential elements and start counting those different parts as they relate to different cryptocurrencies, that creates a very clear picture in terms of how to evaluate the viability and what that cryptocurrency potentially can do or be worth. If any are missing, it's not viable. Like I said again, no community, there's no people. No technology, you don't have a cryptocurrency. No liquidity, you can't trade it. It's not worth anything. So in terms of where does the absolute failure come from, like we mentioned earlier there, if we're missing a pillar, that's failure. But if the technology exists and there's a community of people who are willing to buy those coins, and there's liquidity, there's the ability to trade it, then it doesn't matter who was in charge. And that's how Bitcoin started. That's how all cryptocurrency is supposed to work. That's the nature of open source technology and the nature of decentralized governance, basically. We can then visually and ideally quantify these things where basically any of the pillars, if they change or have different densities or different sizes, will affect your viability. Your method for quantifying this, that's individual, that's up to, those are opportunity spots, basically, in terms of figuring out how you would do this. But on quick glance, it's very easy to do. So a common question that comes up, for example, why is Ethereum not the top coin? Because it has all this functionality over Bitcoin. If you do a three pillars analysis on that, the question becomes very simple. From a technology perspective, again, people talk about Ethereum being technologically superior to Bitcoin. Ethereum has more capabilities, but that's not necessarily more technology. And the technology has to serve the benefit of the economy, which represents all three pillars. So when you start to make that comparison, it starts to get a little bit more clear. Where it gets really obvious is if you examine the liquidity side of things. If you were to compare Bitcoin and Ethereum from a liquidity perspective, it becomes very simple. Imagine all of the cryptocurrency exchanges dropped off the face of the planet. What would liquidity look like for Bitcoin versus Ethereum, or many other coins for that matter? Bitcoin, you can still trade it for stuff, people buy it, the merchants use it, etc. Whereas Ethereum, not as many. Now, admittedly, that would heavily affect the ICO market in terms of pricing and stuff. But overall, this paints a much clearer picture and a much easier way to understand the viability and ultimately the value and longevity related with a cryptocurrency or blockchain or project. There you have it. That's what a cryptocurrency is. It's technology, community, liquidity. All interrelated, all interdependent, but all separate. Thank you. Yeah, it was short and sweet. That's the beauty of it. So if anybody has any questions, I'll be more than happy to answer. Or we can talk afterwards. Yeah, the quintessential elements one, that's one that people especially like. It's available on my LinkedIn profile as well. That was one of the earlier pieces that we put out to help share. The quintessential elements of a viable cryptocurrency ecosystem actually is very comparable to the early days of the web. So I've been around for a long time in the technology business. I give you an idea of history. I literally helped write the book on streaming media. So I have a chapter in the Streaming Media Bible, first edition, whatever year that was ago. So that gives you an idea of the history in terms of how far back I go in technology. The quintessential elements is actually reminiscent of the early days of the web, where I sat in on these meetings. I'm sure there's probably people in this room who also sat in on the meetings where, okay, so a company needs a website. We're going to do a website. Let's have a meeting and talk about what that means. So, okay, we're going to have a page that has a way to contact the company. And, we're going to have another page that tells you about the company. And so what I'm spewing right now sounds like nonsense because it's a given, and that websites have been around forever and everybody knows the standard things. But when those things were emerging, those things weren't clear. And it took a period of time for people to understand that there were consistent elements that were required for a website to function. This is the same thing with cryptocurrency today and those quintessential elements. If any of those things are missing, you don't have a viable you don't have a cryptocurrency. Simple. But the more of those things that you have, the better it is. And this follows Bitcoin or any of you can trace the origins of Bitcoin, Ether, Litecoin, Dogecoin, pick any of them out of the lot, the ones that are still around, and the ones that don't necessarily follow the logic that is being put out there in terms of, how is such and such technology different from Bitcoin or Ethereum? And, I can ask you to take a look at Dogecoin as an example for anybody who knows. Or there are a lot of questions that come up in terms of why something needs to be different or otherwise, and that's because we're dealing with a completely different animal here. This is a completely different thing altogether. We're not dealing with just technology. We're not just dealing with just a product. We're not dealing with just a group of users. We're dealing with three elements that represent an economy. And that's a very, very different thing than anything that's ever existed in the past. So these are exciting times, and that's why we're here. So, question?
Talk a little bit about the community pillar and just kind of your thoughts on starting and building a community.
Right. So. Yeah. So the question was basically relating to community and discussing a little bit more on the community side of things and how you would develop a community, I guess, from either a starting perspective, or that would also be applicable to as you're going along. So on the community side of things, community is all about people and supporters. And Bitcoin is the best, obviously, but the ultimate example of how people have driven the value of something, the viability of it. Where basically Bitcoin, I'm one of the early people where basically I came across the technology, thought it was cool, and just started telling people about it. And there's lots of people in this room who have shared that experience or are still doing it or were brought into the cryptocurrency world because of that experience. So that's also a differentiator. So when you have, the Ethereum community, for example, is very different from the Bitcoin community for many, many different reasons. So the community, as we've established, is an equal pillar in terms of its necessity for the viability of a cryptocurrency ecosystem. So it's important to build out the community, as far as we're concerned, in parallel with the other two. And then it's your community that ultimately supports whatever the mission or the goals or the objectives or the ideals of that project are. So again, when you start to quantify things, if you're dealing with a project that's very product centric and only deals with it has a particular function, that starts to reduce your community. Bitcoin is anybody who wants to do digital money. That's a potentially very big community. Ethereum, similar things. Whereas once you start to get into more product-centric blockchain or cryptocurrency-related efforts, you're starting to reduce things. And it's not to say that it's impossible, it's not viable, but you're putting limitations. So when building out the community side of things, you want to build out your community in the best way that it's going to help build out or contribute to your technology and your liquidity as well. So, and then that's generally a very organic thing as well. It depends on the mission and the ideals of what you're trying to do. But all equally important. It's that no one is more or less important. They're all equally important and should be developed concurrently. Any other questions?
How do you balance liquidity and opportunity? So if the tech and community is good, but liquidity is not there yet, doesn't that present an opportunity for better gains or vice versa? If once the liquidity does come, you lose some of your potential gains as an investor. So how do you approach a lack of liquidity when you lack the first two steps?
Right. So I'm pretty sure everybody was able to hear that because we're yelling across the entire room. But basically, the question revolves around essentially how do you build out or how do you deal with a lack of liquidity or building out, or I hope I'm not going to paraphrase it well, but I think I know how to answer it. So let's try and go that way. The short version, or again, these are all things that are being discovered. For one, that's one of the awesome parts about being in this industry is we're all actively learning and establishing what these things really mean. Now, there are math people out there who are significantly better at math than I am, who are calculating these kinds of things. But ultimately, that type of thing comes down to supply and demand, right? So the liquidity side of things, exchanges are the easy way, or maybe not the low-hanging fruit or the obvious way, but depending on the nature of the coin, again, merchant adoption is a big thing, right? And again, that was the early days of Bitcoin. When in the early days of Bitcoin, there was Mt. Gox, right? And that was pretty much it. But yet there were a lot of people who were exchanging Bitcoin and doing things with Bitcoin, but not doing those things on Mt. Gox. So they would either be doing OTC trades or buying and selling stuff, right? So if you have a liquidity problem, or not a liquidity problem. Let's say you're early in the development of liquidity, then basically you want to develop your liquidity, well, you want to develop your community as well, because that's going to help with liquidity, and you're also going to want to find the other ways to do it. So the exchanges are obvious, but merchant adoption is very helpful, and then that ultimately does come back to the nature of the coin or the token itself, where, you know, all tokens, any of these types of things in terms of the public blockchain, public ledger side of things, anybody can trade anything. That's it. Any of you can trade anybody's coins if you have them. So there is this built-in liquidity as almost a byproduct or by the nature of the technology itself. So like I say, it's the combination of the three, and then basically the more merchants you can find, or the more partners, or basically the more ways you can find to trade the coin for something other than the coin, you're building out your liquidity. Does that help? I hope that, so yeah, cool. All right. Awesome, thank you everybody.